Hi, class. Welcome back. It's Dr. Lindner. We are still on neurology, and on this next portion, we're going to be talking about the brain and give you a little bit of a general overview to help you with your studying on the neural system. When we talk about the brain is a pretty large organ. It weighs about 3 pounds, and it functions in your sensations, in your memory, your emotions, your decision making, your behavior, all of that is controlled by the brain. And the nervous system develops, it's really the first system that develops. Of all the systems, the very first is the neural system. And it develops somewhere around the 18th day. After sperm and egg come together, somewhere around the 18th day, the neural system develops. And I know most people think the heart and the cardiovascular system is the first thing that develops when a baby is being developed, but it's actually the neural system. That's the first system that forms, and then all other systems develop thereafter. And this is why the neural system is referred to as the master system. It's why I love being a doctor of chiropractic so much, is because we deal with the master system. Okay, so when we look at the brain, we'll notice some key names that we need to familiarize ourselves with. Cerebrum, which is a pretty large part, not to be confused with cerebellum. And again, this is anterior, this is posterior, this is the person from a lateral view. This would be the front, this would be the back, so the cerebellum is in the back. Um, we have in the center a region called the diencephalon, and the diencephalon relates to parts of the brain that has everything involving the word thalamus in it. Thalamus, hypothalamus, these are parts of the diencephalon. Okay, then we have the brainstem. So you'll be hearing about the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. Medulla, pons, and the midbrain. And that would be from inferior to superior. From inferior to superior. Medulla, pons, and the midbrain. When we look at the person from the side, so this picture here was this exactly. So we see the cerebrum, we see the cerebellum, sometimes called the little brain in the back. Here's the diencephalon with the thalamus, the hypothalamus, epithalamus, and the brain stem, medulla, pons, and midbrain. Now, when we look at the cerebrum, which is really the largest part of the brain, look at the different colors here, because these are some important sections of the cerebrum. Now, this is anterior, back here is posterior. So the eyes would be here and the occiput would be back here. So the frontal lobe is protected by the frontal bone. The occipital lobe is protected by the occipital bone. The temporal lobe of the brain is protected by the temporal bone. The parietal lobe of the brain is protected by the parietal bone. Remember when you did osteology? Okay, so the frontal lobe is involved in your decision making, your motivation. That's frontal lobe. So if you know of someone that lacks motivation and lacks ambition and lacks drive, there's a problem in the frontal lobe. Okay? The frontal lobe is also your motor region. All the initiation of motor control and thinking about moving your body is initiated in the frontal lobe. Specifically, in this part right here called the pre-central gyrus that looks red. And if there's a pre-central gyrus, there's going to be a post-central gyrus. But the post-central gyrus is part of the parietal lobe. This is a lot to do with sensory information. So the post-central gyrus, the post-central gyrus is sensory, and the pre-central gyrus is motor. In between the pre-central gyrus and the post-central gyrus is a central sulcus, right? So there's this little valley right here called a central sulcus. In front of it is the pre-central gyrus, and behind it is the post-central gyrus. The pre-central gyrus is where all of your motor information originates to move all your body parts, and the post-central gyrus is all where the sensory input from all of your body parts end up. And when you look up or Google something called the homunculus, you will see a very, very awkward picture of the human body represented in the pre-central gyrus and the human body represented in the post-central gyrus. It's a very awkward picture of a person with like a big head, big lips, big genitalia, big fingers, big feet, and that just shows the way that the picture is drawn in such a distorted way, the parts of the body that are represented by the most neurons. And it's usually the parts that require the most precision to move, like your eyeballs, your fingers, your lips. Your lips are highly sensitive. Your fingers are highly sensitive. So those parts, whether they're motor or sensory, are going to take up the most part of the brain, whereas the larger body parts, like your quadriceps and your hamstrings, although they're huge body parts, they don't really take up a lot of space because it moves the body in a more grotesque way, not in a really refined way and a delicate way. Okay. The occipital lobe deals with vision, right? So your visual center is back here. The temporal lobe is more for like your hearing and taste, more hidden deep here in the temporal lobe. Your cerebellum is more for balance and coordination. Like if a police officer pulls you over and asks you to walk heel to toe, they're checking to see if alcohol got into the cerebellum. And if it did, your balance is going to be off because the cerebellum controls balance and coordination. So walking heel toe, heel toe, heel toe is cerebellar function. Touching your fingertip to the tip of your nose with your eyes closed is coordination. So balance and coordination is the cerebellum. And yes, there are cerebellar diseases that can affect balance and coordination as well, but alcohol is one of the biggies. Then we have the medulla and the pons. We can't see the midbrain here, but we'd have to cut away a little bit of the temporal lobe in order to see that. And again, this is an actual brain, so now we can see the frontal lobe, and we could see the occipital lobe. Once we find the central sulcus, which is this depression, this valley that runs the whole way, right from here down to the temporal lobe, once we find that, in front of it is the precentral gyrus, and behind it is the post-central gyrus. This is motor, and this is sensory. The precentral gyrus is part of the frontal lobe. The postcentral gyrus is part of the parietal lobe. Again, frontal lobe is more your emotions, your ambition, your drive, but your frontal lobe is also involved with inhibiting certain behavior, like being able to stop yourself from doing something. And this is why little children sometimes don't have the best behavior. Why did you push your brother down the stairs? I don't know. Don't do it again. Okay. Next day they pushed a little brother or sister down the stairs. Didn't I tell you not to do it? Uh-huh. Why did you do it? I don't know. The frontal lobe is responsible for inhibition. Road rage, when someone cuts someone off and then they follow them for like 20 exits and they shoot at them, right? That is the inability to inhibit. That's frontal lobe lesion, frontal lobe damage. When a baby is born, their heart rate is so fast because the frontal lobe can't inhibit and slow down the heart rate. When a baby is, for the first few years, the frontal lobe isn't developed, so they can't inhibit bowel movements and urination, so babies wear diapers. As people get older, the frontal lobe starts to break down a little bit if they're unhealthy, and then they have to wear Depends or a diaper, and they lose control of bowel and urination once again. So frontal lobe is being able to inhibit. A lot of ADHD issues are frontal lobe issues where they can't inhibit and stop certain behaviors. Okay? Here's your cerebellum in the back, balance and coordination, medulla, and pons in the midbrain we can't quite see, and there's your temporal lobe. When we're looking at the brain from this perspective, we could see the medulla and we can see the pons. Pons means bridge. Below the medulla is your spinal cord. Okay, when we look at some of these terms, look at gyrus and let's look at sulcus. Remember the central sulcus? Those are the valleys. The gyri are the hills. So we have hills and valleys. The gyri are the hills. The sulcus is the valley. When you have a very deep, deep valley, that's called a fissure. So we have some different fissures. I'll show you where the longitudinal fissure is. So when we look at the brain from a bird's eye view on the top, and this is anterior, and this is posterior, this is left, and this is right, we can see the frontal lobe, we can see the parietal lobe, and we can see the occipital lobe. Right here in green, that's the longitudinal fissure. Kind of separates the left and right hemisphere of the cerebrum. Then I'm going to show you the precentral gyrus. Right there, there's the precentral, and in front of it, I'm sorry, here's the central sulcus, the yellow is the central sulcus. In front of it is the precentral gyrus, and behind it is the postcentral. Pre is before, post is after. And from the lateral view, again, we can see the central sulcus here. So in front of it is the precentral gyrus, and behind it is the postcentral gyrus. Motor, sensory. Motor, sensory. There's the central sulcus. Okay. Here is the parieto-occipital sulcus. That's between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. It's really right there. Okay, what are the functions of the left and right hemisphere? It's kind of neat. So let's look at the left hemisphere. When I think of left, I think linear, L and L. Left, I think linear. What do I mean by linear? Science, numbers. This is all linear thinking. Language, spoken and written language, reasoning, logic, linear, left. You know, when someone's left brain, they're all science, numbers, language, they're all left brained. When someone's right brained, they're more artistic, more into music and spatial patterns. Does this shirt go with these pants? Where do you think I should put this couch? Where does this picture go best? So that's more right-sided. Okay. Females have a larger connection between the right and left brain. That connection is what we call the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the band of white matter connecting the left and the right cerebral hemispheres, and that's what this is saying here. The females have a larger connection or a larger band of corpus callosum connecting the left and right brain. When someone has a stroke to the left side of the brain, they can get aphasia, which is the inability to speak and communicate because of because of spoken language. Okay, there's a side of the left brain called Broca's area, number 44, Broca's area, which is the motor part of the speech. So when someone has a stroke to the left side of the brain, their language, their ability to speak will be affected, but the right side of the body may have movement disorders. The left brain controls the right side of the body. Okay. Um, when we look at the brain, we have different types of brain waves: alpha, beta, theta, and delta. Alpha, beta, theta, and delta. When you're awake and you're at rest, we want to see alpha waves. When you're thinking during a test, we want to see beta waves and listening to my lecture. But if you're under emotional stress, we'll see more theta waves. And when you're in a deep sleep, we should see delta waves. The brain wave activity is called an EEG, which stands for electroencephalogram. EEG, like encephalitis, inflammation of the brain, electroencephalogram, EEG. Okay, when we come back, we'll talk about certain coverings of the brain and protection of the brain.